All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about the tensions between the Russians and the Turks. There was an airstrike in the Idlib province where a lot of the heavy fighting has been taking place. The Russian Air Force slaughtered dozens of Turkish backed Syrian rebels. This is simply another step of the current escalation that has been transpiring between the Turks and the Russians in Syria. In February of this year, the Russian and Syrian air forces did a joint strike on the Turkish military, killing around 33 Turkish soldiers. It was a direct attack on Turkey. It was a direct attack on the Turkish military. And so the line has already been crossed. The line has already been crossed. And we also should remember the fact that the Turks also shot down a Russian fighter jet. Uh, so the line has already been crossed. It's not really a question of, well, is there going to be a war between the Turks and the Russians? It's really a question of when is this war going to finally take place? When is this war going to finally spark? When are the Turks and the Russians finally going to have an all-out war? Because historically, these two countries have been enemies. The Russians had numerous wars with the Ottoman Empire, and the Russians won every single time. The Turks have never won a war with the Russians. The Turks have won battles, but the Turks have never won a war fighting against the Russians. The Russians are the greatest enemies of the Turks. Historically speaking, they are the greatest enemies. Um, the fact that Turkey has lost so many wars with the Russians tells me that they're not going to be friends anytime soon. They still don't like each other. Now, you can say, well, there are diplomatic relations between the Turks and the Russians, and you would be right. But they are diplomatic relations between all sorts of countries that don't like each other. For example, they are diplomatic relations between the Japanese and the Chinese. In fact, the two are big trading partners. They make money from each other all the time, yet they hate each other. They don't like each other. The Americans and the Germans were making money together. And then they had a war against each other in the Second World War. So diplomatic relations, and I understand that in our own time, diplomacy is key to everything, and diplomacy is so highly elevated. But the reality is that it doesn't really mean much when diplomacy is up against historical animosity. And once that animosity fully manifests itself, all that diplomacy just dissipates like smoke. It's just smoke and mirrors at the end of the day. The Russians and the Turks are really doing an increase in escalation over Syria. And you are seeing these two countries working to expand their hegemony. Remember the war that took place between Russia and Georgia. The Russians wanted two regions of Georgia. They wanted South Ossetia and they wanted Abkhazia. Now, these are two regions that are internationally recognized as a part of, being a part of Georgia. And the Russians see these two regions as satellite states for their government. So the Russians want to control the Caucasus because the Russian Empire historically has had hegemony and control over the Caucasus. The Turks also want to control the Caucasus because the Ottoman Empire historically has controlled the Caucasus. So these two countries historically have been competitors over global hegemony, over regional hegemony. The Turks today are heavily engaged in a proxy war against Armenia. That's why the Turks are backing Azerbaijan in the war between the Azeris and Armenians over Nagorno-Karabakh. Why is Turkey so involved in this conflict? Because they want to control the Caucasus. They want to control Azerbaijan. They want to control Armenia. They want to revive their empire. The Armenians are absolutely terrified, rightfully so, because, you know, the whole thing with the Armenian genocide, the fact that the Ottomans butchered around 1 million Armenians. The Ottomans, well, they're not called Ottomans yet, but the Neo-Ottomans, I should say, they want to resume from where the old Ottomans left off in the Armenian genocide. The Russians invaded Crimea. Crimea is right on the Black Sea. What's across from the Black Sea? Turkey. I mean, you go to Crimea, you cross the Black Sea, and you're in Turkey, and vice versa. You go to Turkey, you cross the Black Sea, and you're in Ukraine. You're in Crimea. So the Russians invaded Crimea because they want to have a foothold against the Turks over the Black Sea. They both want to control the Black Sea. And after the Russians took over Crimea, you better believe that NATO was strongly backing Turkey and made sure that the Turkish Navy was all over the Black Sea. So you have Turkey and Russia having a rivalry over the Caucasus, a rivalry over the Black Sea, rivalry over Crimea. The whole thing with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. You know, a lot of people didn't pick up on this. A lot of people didn't notice this. But remember, the Ukrainians, they've had an Orthodox Church that has been, well, until recently, they had an Orthodox Church that was under the control of the Moscow Patriarchate. And then the head, the Pope, if you will, of the Orthodox Church, Bartholomew, he said, no, the Ukrainians can have their own independent church. And the Ukrainian nationalists were absolutely elated by this. Well, why? Why did the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church allow the Ukrainians to have their own church independent of Moscow? It's because the Turks pressured Bartholomew to do that. Because the Turks want to use the Ukrainians, and the United States ultimately, they want to use the Ukrainians against the Russians. The Ukrainians are a NATO satellite. The Ukrainians are being used by NATO against the Russians. And the Americans are also worried that they could lose Turkey to Russia. They're actually worried about this. You'll hear people like John Bolton saying things like, well, you know, we could lose Turkey as an ally, and Turkey could become Turkey could form an alliance with Russia against NATO. And they point to the fact that Turkey bought a bunch of S-400 air defense systems from Russia. Well, while this is true, I don't see the Russians becoming strong allies with Turkey anytime soon, because of the fact that they've had so many wars between each other, historically speaking. All of a sudden, they're going to be friends. All of a sudden, it's going to be like, hey, yeah, you know, Turkey, Russia, yeah, let's get together and let's, you know, form an empire. It's just, I don't see this happening. The fact that Turkey supported the idea of the creation of an independent Ukrainian church, which is something that Moscow absolutely despises, because after the Ukrainian church was formed, after the Ukrainians were allowed to have their own church, what happened? The Russians began to split up with the entire Orthodox Church. I mean, just recently there was another schism. The Russians told Bartholomew to go to hell. They said, nope, to hell with you. Moscow Patriarchate is forming its own church, independent of Constantinople. The Greeks recognized the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Russians told the Greeks to piss off. The Coptic Church in Alexandria, Egypt, said, we recognize the Ukrainian Church. The Russians said to the Alexandrians, we're done with you. We've cut ties with you. The Russian Orthodox Church has cut ties with all of the Orthodox world over Ukraine. And the Turks were the ones, of course, you know, on the command of their American master. The Turks were the ones who pressured Bartholomew to do that. So this idea that Turkey all of a sudden is going to be friends with Russia, I mean, I've kind of entertained the idea, but I don't really believe it. It's just hard for me to believe that. In the East, animosities don't die. They don't die. In the West, you can say the same thing, but in the West, they're better at hiding it. In the East, animosity doesn't die. Japanese and Chinese people still hate each other. You have Chechens versus Russians, Dagestanis versus Russians, Lebanese versus Palestinians, they still hate each other. Serbs versus everyone else in the Balkans with the exception of Montenegro. They all hate each other. You just see this hatred. You see this horrendous hatred. The Chinese and the Indians hate each other over Tibet. Even in South America, you have animosities that don't die. So animosities don't really die, especially in the East. Especially in the East. So this idea that Turkey and Russia, yeah, they're going to be allies, and Turkey's just going to become a puppet state for the Russians. Turkey wants to establish its empire again. That's why they're in the Caucasus. Russia wants to do the same thing. That's why Russia's in the Caucasus. Now, Russia recently said that the Russians are open to the idea of Nagorno-Karabakh being completely given back to the Azeris. But again, this is just diplomatic talk. The fact that Russia killed dozens of Turkish soldiers this year, the fact that the Russians killed dozens of Turkish-backed Syrian rebels, it just tells me that there is an escalation that is transpiring, and it's only intensifying more and more. And eventually there is going to be a war between the two countries. It really is that obvious to me. Anyway, hope you guys have learned something from this video. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.